Hello and welcome to Chapter 4, Organization and Regulation of Body Systems. After we finish with the Chapter 4, you should be able to answer the following questions. What is a tissue? What are the characteristics of connective, epithelial, muscle, and nervous tissue? What's the difference between studying anatomy and physiology? Can you list the 11 human body systems that we're going to look at? Can you describe the location of body parts relative to others? You're going to get practice doing that in your lab this week. What are the names of our body's cavities? And then we're going to look at the parts and functions of the integumentary system, which is our skin. So let's start with that first question, because we just finished up Chapter 3, where we were looking at the individual parts of a cell and how they function and how they move things back and forth. But eventually, those cells are going to come together and work together to perform a single function. And that is the definition of a tissue. So we've seen how they can work independently, but then when they work together as part of a larger system, then they become a tissue. There are 4 types of tissues in the human body. We have connective tissue, which provides support and stores fat. We have epithelial tissue, which covers all of our body surfaces, including lining our body cavities and then each of our individual organs. Glands are also made up of epithelial tissue. We have muscle tissue, which makes movement possible and allows substances to move through our body. And then finally, we have nervous tissue, which is specialized to conduct nerve impulses from one part of the body to another. So that's like our body's form of communication. We're going to go through each of those types of tissue individually. Most of the cells of our body is connective tissue. This is also the most diverse type of tissue, and it comes in many different forms, 6 to be exact. All connective tissues, no matter what type they are embedded in what we call the extracellular matrix. The extracellular matrix. And that's made of protein and some kind of ground substance. And it's the ground substance that varies depending on the type of connective tissue that it is. Bone, for example, has a solid ground substance, while blood has a fluid ground substance, and cartilage has a gelatinous ground substance. So it's that ground substance that is giving the tissue its structure and its what word am I looking for? The way that it feels. The protein and the ground substance are both secreted by the specialized cells that make up the connective tissue. So unlike other types of tissue that we'll see, connective tissue is made up of mostly that extracellular matrix and relatively few cells. So as we go through and look at some of the slides, you'll notice that big difference between connective tissue. Relatively few cells with a lot of stuff on the outside. Let's look at those 6 different kinds of connective tissue. First, we have loose connective tissue that's found underneath our skin. One example, has fewer fibers in its matrix than other types of connective tissue, so it's not held together very closely. And loose connective tissue acts kind of like the packing material within our body. It fills in a lot of the spaces between our other tissues. So spaces between our organs, spaces between our body cavities. We're going to find a lot of what we call fascia. And that's made of loose connective tissue. Having this loose connective tissue between our muscles allows muscles to move against each other without rubbing. And even though it doesn't have as many matrix fibers as other types of connective tissue, it does have 2 different types. Collagen fibers make it very strong, and elastic fibers are going to make it very, very stretchy. So we'll kind of compare loose connective tissue with our next type, which is dense connective tissue or fibrous connective tissue. And compared to the loose connective tissue, dense connective tissue has a lot of collagen fibers. in its matrix, and they are bound much more tightly together. You can even see that in the slide. So here we had a lot of space, very few fibers, only one here, long collagen fiber. Here in dense connective tissue, all of these are very tightly packed collagen fibers, making it very, very strong. And they're stacked tightly on top of each other, and then the cells are squished in between. Each of these little black dots is one of the specialized cells. So, like all connective tissues, very few cells compared to the extracellular matrix. Dense connective tissue is what makes up our ligaments and our tendons, the things that hold different pieces of our bodies together. Ligaments connecting bone to another bone, tendons connecting a muscle to a bone. So very important, right? For holding everything together, we want this to be a strong connective tissue, lots of collagen fibers. Adipose connective tissue is our next type, and this contains cells that specialize in fat storage. So we're going to have a lot of lipids packed into these cells. And these function as a form of insulation and a shock absorber around our organs. So insulating, keeping our internal temperature the same. That's one of those big examples of a homeostasis that we're trying to maintain. A shock absorber around our organs, if we are to experience an impact, we have that layer of fat to prevent internal damage. And then our bodies also use these fat stores as energy, as if we don't have that quicker energy source like glucose available. Cartilage connective tissue has a gelatinous matrix and provides the cushion between our bones and provides the structure for our ears and our nose. You can feel how much more flexible your nose and ears are than your fingers, which are made of bone. Cartilage connective tissue does not have any blood vessels. If there are no blood vessels, then nutrients can't get to these cells because it's our cardiovascular system that's providing all of the delivery of those nutrients through diffusion. So regeneration of connective tissue, or of cartilage connective tissue specifically, happens very slowly or not at all. So as cartilage is damaged and lost, it's not easily regenerated. And that's why we get things as we age like arthritis and pain when our bones are rubbing together. That cartilage connective tissue has broken down and it's not being regenerated. Bone, on the other hand, has a very rich blood supply going to it, and it heals very, very quickly. Bone is the form of connective tissue that forms our skeletal system. The matrix secreted by bone cells is hard because of that large amount of calcium. So we're storing a lot of calcium and phosphorus nutrients in our bone tissue. Bone obviously provides the support to keep the body up and provides points for muscles to attach and allow movement. And then blood cells are also produced from the marrow within our bones, and the bone itself is storing other nutrients in addition to calcium and phosphorus, like lipids. We're going to see that in our bone marrow as well, the storage of additional fat. We'll talk more about the shape and structure of bone tissue when we get to the skeletal system. Blood is our last form of connective tissue that we'll talk about. Its matrix is a liquid called plasma. That top photo is an image of blood cells showing all of the different cell types. We've already seen that red blood cells transport oxygen to cells and take carbon dioxide away. The other components of blood are white blood cells, our leukocytes. These work to fight infection, and then we also have platelets, our thrombocytes, which help to clot blood. We'll talk more about those when we get to our cardiovascular system. But all three of those types of blood cells originate from our bone marrow. So they're not being replicated from the cells within the blood. they're coming from a highly protected source inside of our bones. So those are the 6 types of connective tissue. We have loose connective tissue, dense connective tissue, adipose, cartilage, bone, and blood. Our next group, we're going to look at muscle tissues, often called muscle fibers, and I think you can kind of see why from our image there. They're long and thin and strong. The fibers are tightly packed together and have lots and lots of blood supply, not just for regeneration, but also delivering all of the ingredients that we need to be constantly undergoing cellular respiration. The contraction of the muscles takes a lot of energy, but it's also what causes us to be able to move, which is important. There are 3 different types of muscle tissue in the human body. We have our skeletal muscles. You can probably guess from the name that it's attached to bone and is primarily responsible for causing like our bodily movements. So moving our arms and our legs and holding up our torsos. The contractions of skeletal muscles are mostly voluntary or under our personal control. The cells are long and cylindrical, and each cell might have multiple nuclei. So we call this multinucleate. The striations or layers that you see in the image are the layering of the different proteins, actin and myosin. And it's the interaction between those 2 proteins that causes the muscle to contract. Cardiac muscle is found only in the walls of the heart, so only one place in the body. The contractions of cardiac tissue, muscle tissue, are involuntary or automatic, which is why we don't have to remember to beat our heart. Unlike skeletal muscle fibers, cardiac muscle cells have only a single nucleus. The cells are still cylindrical in shape and are connected end to end and highly branched. So when you see this branching, then you know you're looking at cardiac muscle tissue. But we still are going to see striations, actin and myosin, allowing for that constant contraction of that heart muscle. Our last type of muscle tissue is called smooth muscle. And this type of muscle is found in the walls of our internal organs, like the stomach, the intestine, the bladder, lining our blood vessels and our airways. The contraction of smooth muscle in the stomach mixes food and then propels it into the digestive tract. That's one example of the use for smooth muscle. The cells contain only one nucleus, and we're not going to see any striations here. The shape of the cells are kind of tapered end to end, a much softer look than our other 2 types of muscle tissue. And again, these are mostly involuntary and used for moving products through the body. Nervous tissue makes up our nervous system, including the brain, spinal cord, and our nerves. And this is what enables us to detect and respond to stimuli in our environment, which, as we call, is one of the things that makes us living. There are 2 types of cells that make up nervous tissue. We have neurons, which is the one large one in the image, and these generate and conduct nerve impulses. The middle part with the nucleus is called the cell body. And then the smaller branches coming off of the cell body are called the dendrites, and those anchor it into the surrounding tissue. And then the long one headed off to the top of the image here is called the axon. The second cell type in nervous tissue are the neuroglia, and there are far more of these than there are neurons, and they surround each of the neurons. So in nervous tissue, you'll find the neurons and then all of the surrounding neuroglia. Nervous tissue, like cartilage, has very little reproductive ability to create new cells, and that's why traumatic brain injury is seldom recovered from. Most of our neurons are formed early in our brain's development, and if they're lost, they're often not regenerated. This is probably why we have the neuroglia to defend and protect those neurons and reduce the likelihood that they are damaged. I'm going to pick up with epithelial tissue in our next video in part 2.